What's going on, guys? Welcome back. Another unnamed gaming discussion, if you will. Neal Bauer back with me. Do me a favor, take a moment, like button, subscribe button, criticism in the comment section. Twitter, Shutdown Safety is my username. And I guess to develop a little bit more of a rapport with you guys, I wanted to bring Neal on. I talked about it on Twitter earlier in the week and have a little bit of his side of the EA Sports and Madden discussion and actually talk about something that actually brought me to Neal, one of the most infamous, I don't want to say negative things publicity-wise with Madden, but why don't you share with people your claim to fame, if you will?
Oh, sure. So I've been following Madden for quite some time, and I was a buyer for video games back in the day when 2K and Madden were going head-to-head. And I had a good rapport with the salespeople at EA. Well, what happened in 2004, 2005, when 2K5 came out at the $20 price point, EA went bananas on the inside. Like, they wanted to crush 2K. That was their main goal. So the following season, when they bought the exclusivity license, the people that we were dealing with actually felt pretty bad. The sales reps felt pretty awful about what had happened. They felt that it was kind of underhanded. Their own sales reps felt bad about it. And they were subsequently fired shortly thereafter. So I took it upon myself to see, like, the people that I knew from EA were handled poorly. That I thought the whole NFL licensing arrangement was awful. It was the end of football for me. So what I went out and did is I put together a satirical eBay auction about people who wanted to buy the next year's iteration of Madden, and that went viral back in the day, which was crazy, which means it actually went on television. So my eBay auction made it to G4 TV, made it on Attack of the Show, made it on Ars Technica, and really, I think we hit about 100,000 views in that day on the site. And that's still around. That site's still the auction's still up on our site on doubleplusgoodgames.com. You can look in the search and find Madden Blight, and it will load it up. And actually, it's on the internet as well. So just search Madden Blight, and you'll see our video and the eBay auction. But that's kind of where I've stood on Madden since 2005, 2006.
I will. I'll put a link down in the description for anyone that wants to see that or possibly consider doing it themselves. So, what really has been your big issue with Madden? When is the last time you actually played Madden? I don't know if you had a chance to see it this year at E3 or not. And when you play it, what's the overall impression that it leaves you with?
So as a buyer through the 2000s, I've actually played a lot of the Maddens, but I have not owned a Madden since the days of Sega Genesis. And if I don't know how long your audience has been gaming, but back in the Sega Genesis and Super NES days, Madden was king. It was phenomenal. It was a great game, and it was a powerhouse. It was the only game in town. And it took out Mike Ditka Power Football. It took down Joe Montana Football, Sports Talk Football when it was owned by Sega. It was the bee's knees. But when it transitioned into 3D, and that was originally on the 3DO, Madden skipped that year. It was the one year that Madden skipped developing football, was that transition to 3D. And then when it came out on PlayStation eventually, and eventually on Nintendo 64, they already had new football games in the fray. 989 was developing football, and they never really caught up in the 3D realm. So by the time they started gaining some ground, Visual Concepts delivered 2K Sports for the Dreamcast in 1999. And it turned the entire video game football on its ear. So I haven't really played Madden since, I haven't owned it since then, but I've played it all the way up through. And the one problem I've had with Madden is it's always been animation. It's always been the feel of real football. So, and even up till this year, when I saw it on the floor this year, and I didn't get hands-on with it, but I did see it on the floor, they still have the same animations, it's sliding into place. There's you don't feel like your characters have real traction with the ground. It's always kind of like positional, where they're there and then their bodies will adjust or rotate or morph in a position. And so, we used to complain about games when people couldn't walk upstairs, like their feet wouldn't match up the stairs. That was a game killer for some people. Like, it was an immersion killer. And they've done great strides with making those things work. But Madden still has that floaty thing that drives me bananas.
It's hard to actually conceptualize what's difficult to talk about the game when you watch it, because there's a disconnect, and it's strange because even as you described it there, it's a visual disconnect that you make watching the game, and you can almost tell control-wise, how limiting it's going to be. And I can't think of any other game that I can watch being played and I can say, okay, this lacks the fluidity to give me enough control to make me feel like I'm going to play. And then to actually play the game and have that same, I guess, feeling while you're trying to play it. There's not many games that give you that sense. And it's maybe the worst sense a gamer can have is that you're in absolute not in control of the game, and then it kind of snowballs to where I'm not in control of the player, I'm not in control of the play, I'm not in control of the outcome, I'm not in control of the score, I'm not in control of anything. So when you play the game and you feel that, I guess it makes me wonder if we could harp back to your auction and some of the points that you brought up there, because a lot of it I remember was very distinctly 2K and EA, and certainly that discussion's been had and had and had. But if we talk about the fundamental issues gameplay-wise you have with Madden over the span of the last 10 years now, how many of them can you conceptually visualize minutes in to just watching someone play the game?
Within 2 minutes. And that's the problem with me in sports games, that you can tell pretty much right away. Other video games have the luxury of being video games. So if you're talking fantasy worlds or you're talking, spaceships and shooter type games, there's some margin of error that you can't understand. Like spaceships flying in space, I don't know what that's like. So there's a suspension of disbelief because you don't know. But football is a sport that pretty much almost anybody who's played video game football has actually picked up a football or has had some experience with football. So it's really challenging. It's actually harder for sports games to get it right because there's people who watch it all the time and there's people who've played it. So when I would pick up a controller, and we'll say Madden 15 is a perfect example, when I was on the floor, I picked it up, put it in my hands, and I'm like, within 2 minutes, 2 plays, I'm like, yeah, I have no control. To your point, there may be scripted runs or scripted animations that take place, but I don't feel like if I can spin or I'm doing this, that I have any kind of control. And what's crazy is I know, just like you said, it's hard to visualize or it's hard to express without kind of some kind of visual context, but I'd never had this feeling back on the Dreamcast with 2K. With 2K1, with 2K2. They were just improving that. And then 2K5, where, I believe that's the pinnacle right now. That's the gauge that other games will be rated upon. I felt that. I felt like a connection to the ground. I felt a connection to my player. I felt a connection to my O-line or my defense. I felt connections to all of it. And then the skin over top of it, the ESPN overlay was kind of a nice to have, but it didn't add to the experience. I think Madden goes in reverse, where the overlay, the skin, the pretty is first, and then we work back from that. So again, we can go through the auction, but I still think a lot of those same things are in place.
So I guess it almost, to me, feels like a desensitization of the gamer and the connection between the controller I'm holding and what's on my screen. And I'm with you in terms that I can't stand that. So I guess my question to you would be then, and you touched on it just a little bit there, when you go and you play other games, when you play, a Major League Baseball title, when you play an NBA title, when you play a hockey title, when you play an MMA title, do you have any other game that gives you that disconnect where you can tell or you can visually or maybe actually playing the game feel that same, I guess, vibe, if you will, from Madden?
That's a hard question to answer because I don't want to say that Madden is very pretty to look at. And I've actually watched a lot of commentary come from this last E3, and the game's looking really polished. The heads on the characters, I remember for years, Madden football, and please back me up on this to say I'm not crazy, a lot of their characters had larger heads than the rest of the body, and I don't know if it was the perspective or not. That's early 2000s Madden. But it would just seem they couldn't get things just right. And there are so many games that do just that. The games that seem kind of floaty when someone's running or when someone's turning, and it looks like they're turning on an axis instead of turning with gravity and weight. And that's a byproduct of just games kind of growing into themselves. But a lot of those games have grown past it. Take a look at Far Cry as a perfect example of look at where Far Cry came from, or even Just Cause. It's a third-person type games. Like the animation on the characters, the way the characters move, the way they interact with their environments, they just continually improve upon themselves. And what happens is if a game doesn't, and a game fails miserably, like Kanye or Kane and Lynch, I believe. What the heck was that? There was an awful game that came out. If a game is bad, it usually doesn't get a sequel. Or if a game can't make those corrections, it doesn't get another version. And so that's how natural selections in the video games work. That's why I can't come up with a true example, because most games continually get better. And right now, because it's, again, in my feelings on Madden, it's the only game in town, what's the reason? Why would they improve? They sell millions whether they improve or they don't. So it's tough.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think part of it is a personal pride. I mean, obviously, I have a relationship with the developers that you don't, and I firmly believe in my core, no one actually comes to work every day, hates their job, and continues to aspire to do it on a day-to-day basis. I think there is a high level of effort. It's just, again, when you're working within the confines of a box, how much can you possibly do? You can only put so many coats of paint. You can only put so many layers of code. You can only change so much without destroying so much. And I think that's why the most interesting thing for me is when we go back and we look, when they were going from the PS2 to the PS3 or the Xbox to the Xbox 360, and we didn't get the full game because there was so much recoding that had to be done to clean things up to get from one generation to the next. And they knew how badly it damaged the perception people had in the game, that when we learn now, going from Madden 25 on the 360 and the PS3 up to the Xbox One or the PS4 with that Madden 25, they wanted to make sure, and this is the word that obviously scared so many people, we want it to be a full port. Because they didn't want to go back to where they were before and have to spend, countless, generations of the game trying to get everything coded back in. They wanted to put all that effort into, porting everything over. And I think a lot of people fairly, in my opinion, assume that then, port must mean the whole game carried over. It's the same exact thing. It's just playing at a different rate, or it's just playing at a different calculation.
Well, I think you said it on the show. Yeah, when you were on the Double Plus Good Games podcast, nobody goes into work and says, I'm going to make a shitty game. Nobody does that. And nobody in their right mind would. However, and I'll use NHL 16 as a perfect example. NHL 15 as a perfect example because 16 is not out. So NHL, when it was competing against 2K, 2K was a better sports game in the early 2000s. However, 2K started kind of refining and making their game more arcadey, while EA went the route of making it more sim-like, really kind of going over the top, making it visual and kind of based in the roots of hockey. And they wound up taking 2K to town and destroying them, and they made a fantastic hockey game for years. But the last iterations, especially NHL 2K15, they've kind of gone downhill here and there. They've made some visual tweaks, but they've lost things in the process. And one of the things they've lost these last 2 years, NHL 15 stripped out every pretty much game mode from launch. I don't know if you saw the launch of it, but since they're the only game in town, they launched this subpar product, and it was known to be subpar. And they said, well, we'll release these other things as we roll the game out over the next couple months. And they released some of those, but they didn't update there was no EA Hockey League, EA SHL, which was one of the big draws for hockey. So when you're the only game in town, you start to say, like, okay, where are our resources going to be allocated? What are we going to focus on? And what does our budget look like? And here's the thing. If NHL 15 is a perfect example, it did not sell well. It didn't sell as well as they had hoped because the game was broken. Well, guess what happens next year? They're not going to get a bigger budget because the game is going to be based on what it sold. So it's going to they're going to make any improvements they can with the budget they're allowed. And that's terrible. So their improvement can only be gauged on the sales from last year. So Madden, let's bring it all the way back around to Madden. Say if Madden makes an improvement, or redoes the engine and the game doesn't sell well. Even though it's a better product, the game doesn't sell well. Well, they're sitting there now like, well, we don't get the budget for next year because we haven't sold, so we have to recoup that in our profit and loss. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. But since they're making money hand over fist right now, why risk it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the stance that I've always took. If you're in a suit at EA and you're looking at just numbers, I mean, I firmly believe, these aren't people, they may work in the video game industry, but they're not going home in their Maserati to their mansion to play video games. I mean, let's be honest.
Grand Theft Auto.
Their children may be playing these games and probably have a much different perception of what daddy's line of work is, and certainly I don't expect someone's child to criticize their work. If that happens, then I apologize. But I think that those people only look at the numbers, and I think when you look at a game like Madden and they see the number increase, it's selling, it's doing well, it's profitable, I don't know how you can go to a boardroom and sit there with your investors in the company and say, well, here's our flagship title. Here's the title of the number one sport in America. It's been doing very well numerically. We've decided to totally just gut everything and start back over from scratch. And if it doesn't do well, then, we'll be out a lot of money. But there's a few people that have been very vocal about how much they don't like the game. So we figured it's time to maybe give them, their graces and start over. I totally get where they're coming from in retaining, and I know engine is a bad term to use because it's a series of engines that actually, runs the game, and a series of, very detailed computing, which I understand also looks very sloppy on the screen. But at times, I guess it looks very sloppy on the screen. Other times it looks just morbid. But I think people get lost in that, and that we're not going to have this start over again. Everything gets deleted because of the success that's been there and that's shown itself continually over the years. Whether we like it or not, Madden is a game that has outlasted every other football title in the marketplace. And there's something to be said for that from a sales perspective. Not from a gaming perspective, not from a realism perspective, not from how much we should love it, but from a simple sales perspective with EA Sports. It's outlasted every other competitor. By hook or crook, every other one of them is folded. I realize some of them folded because of the license, but you don't put an asterisk beside that. They don't put number one selling football franchise on the game, asterisks, and then on the back, these other companies got out because we bought the license. It's not the Patriots Super Bowls, okay? It doesn't get the giant asterisks.
I think I hate that argument that says, well, we got to give them due because it sells better. It's the best-selling sports game on the market. And that's like the same argument that Britney Spears is a better musician than Tool because her albums have sold more across this globe.
Well, I get what you're saying. I mean, in theory, I don't want to say that I'm using that argument. I'm just saying there's something to be said for it. Waffle House sells more steaks than anyone in this country. That doesn't mean that, if you set a Waffle House steak beside a Ruth's Chris steak, that I'm going to go to the Waffle House one 9 times out of 10. But, if every Ruth's Chris went out of business, you could look back and say, okay, clearly there was decisions they made that led to the failure of that company. Clearly there's decisions that other football games have made recently, per se, that have led to their inability to put out a game or to challenge Madden for whatever reason. And to that point, you at least have to understand that when you enter that arena, that's what you're going up against. I don't care if Backbreaker ever came out and said, we're competing against EA. I know they weren't designing that game to compete against EA. We knew as the sim community that they weren't, but the kid standing there at the store looking at the shelf sees two football games side by side. He's not saying to himself, oh, well, those games must not be competing against each other, so I'm only going to pick one. He's looking at which one applies to him and which one he wants to play. And I'm sorry, when you're talking about someone who's at a point of sale looking at a game on a rack and may not know exactly what they want, they're going to go for the licensed game. They're going to go for the game that has the awards plastered all over it. That doesn't make it the right choice. I'm just saying historically that's what they go for. That's why in any line of business, any company will stand their product up on their awards. I mean, look at J.D. Power Awards. Look at all the awards, Dodge or other car company will stand behind. Look at crash test ratings the companies stand behind. They put that out there because they're trying to get a point of sale from someone that may not be totally informed. And that's what the front of a video game box does for so many people. And I think that's where I get your point, but you still have to give EA a little bit of credit for what they've been able to achieve in a very long time frame. It literally has driven every other competitor out of the marketplace. Much to my hatred, much to my chagrin, it's occurred. But there's still something to be said. It doesn't mean that it's the greatest product on the planet. It doesn't mean it's the best football simulation ever made. But it means that it's got it to itself where it can say it's the only football game in the marketplace.
You've talked a great deal about a few things, and I'm going to end on this. You are absolutely right. When it comes down to someone coming into a game studio and saying, I'm going to make a crappy game, that doesn't happen. But what does happen is that when a board is responsible for fiscal earnings of a company, then that board delivers the will of the investors of the company. The investors of the company want to keep things status quo, then it remains status quo. So the developers can only do what they can. Now, when you're talking about people in playing games and which games they're going to choose, back in the day we were going to either choose Mario or Sonic. We were going to choose Nintendo or Sega, and we saw how that worked out. But we've missed out on something because of that competition. But when the WWE, WWF at the time, had beat out all its competition, when Vince McMahon took out ECW and took out all of the competition in the place, he went on record saying that he regretted it because it didn't make him as sharp anymore, because he owned everything. He didn't have to do as much, and it really impacted his overall product. That's a guy who runs $1 billion organization saying that. I really hope there's somebody on the inside that feels that way at EA, saying that competition does make us better. And maybe if that ever loosens up, maybe if our investors kind of blink once and the NFL license becomes available, maybe there's a chance that we'll all be great again.
It's funny because at E3, I actually talked to Clint about that. I said, in a racing perspective, if we didn't have someone that was faster than us, if we didn't have a team that pushed every envelope to the nth degree in an effort to get faster, then every team would literally make no ground in terms of improving their cars at all. We would just be content to run where we are. But because there's always, one team, one organization that's willing to continue to strive to be the best there, we have to continue to try to meet that mark. And it happens across the board in every form of industry. But I think one word that you brought up is diversity, which ironically was the reason we started to do this in the first place. I want to bring, more diverse content to you guys. I want to know what you guys want to hear about. I want to know what you guys want to have discussions on with us. I want you guys to try to help come up with a name for this thing that's probably going on 20 minutes now if you're still listening. But I do appreciate you taking time to check it out. I thank you for watching this video, and we will be back next week with more content. I will have more football breakdowns coming up shortly.